Suffering is not an accident. It may be written into the script long before you ever arrive on the stage. That idea is unsettling because most of us grow up believing the opposite. We believe that life should be controllable, that if we make the right decisions, think the right thoughts, and work hard enough, we should be able to construct a life where suffering is minimal, maybe even avoidable. And when pain does appear, we assume something has gone wrong. Either we made a mistake or someone else did. Either we failed or the world treated us unfairly. But what if that assumption itself is the misunderstanding? If you've ever asked yourself, why is this happening to me? If you've ever felt like life somehow picked you out of the crowd and placed difficulty directly in your path, if you've ever believed that somewhere along the way you took a wrong turn and ended up living the wrong story, then this idea might feel uncomfortable. Because you probably think suffering is either your fault or someone else's fault. You probably think that if the right choices had been made, things could have unfolded differently. Maybe you imagine an alternate version of your life, a timeline where the relationship didn't collapse, the career didn't stall, the illness never appeared, the betrayal never happened. We carry these imaginary versions of life quietly inside our minds, and compared to those imaginary lives, the real one can feel deeply disappointing. But in the next few minutes, something interesting may begin to shift in the way you see pain. Instead of viewing suffering as punishment, or injustice, or random chaos, you may begin to see it as something woven directly into the human experience itself, not designed to crush you, but designed to shape you. And once you begin to see suffering that way, your relationship with pain begins to change. Look at your life honestly for a moment. Did you choose your parents? Did you choose the emotional climate of the home you were born into? Did you choose your genetic wiring, whether your nervous system leans toward calm or anxiety, toward optimism or sensitivity? Did you choose the historical era you were born into, the economic system you entered, the cultural expectations surrounding you? Of course not. And yet, every one of those forces quietly shaped the way your mind works today. They shaped how easily you trust people. They shaped how quickly you feel threatened. They shaped whether you interpret mistakes as temporary setbacks or as evidence that something is wrong with you. They shaped your ambitions, your fears, your definition of success, even your sense of what love should feel like. Much of the suffering you experience today began long before your conscious decisions ever appeared. Imagine a child growing up in a household where love is conditional. Praise arrives only when achievements appear. Silence follows mistakes. Emotional warmth is unpredictable. The child learns something very quickly, though no one explicitly teaches it. The child learns that worth must be earned, that mistakes are dangerous, that rest is risky. Years later, that child becomes an adult who works endlessly, who fears slowing down, who cannot relax even when life is stable. Success does not feel satisfying because the nervous system remains on alert. Now, ask yourself an honest question. Did that adult invent their suffering? Or did it unfold from a script written long before they understood what was happening? Look even deeper. The parents themselves likely grew up under similar conditions. Their parents did too. Expectations travel across generations like echoes moving through time. Trauma echoes, fear echoes, even silence echoes. The suffering was not created by one person. It was inherited. Now consider another scene. A young woman lies in bed late at night scrolling through social media. She sees pictures of vacations in tropical places, carefully edited bodies, smiling couples celebrating anniversaries, promotions announced with confident captions. At first she feels neutral. Then comparison begins. She notices her own life suddenly feels smaller. Her career feels uncertain. Her relationship feels less exciting. She feels behind. A quiet sense of inadequacy creeps in. Eventually she blames herself. She believes she should be doing better. But step back for a moment. The algorithm was designed to capture attention. The culture was built around performance and visibility. The economic system rewards constant engagement. Her insecurity is not simply personal weakness. It is part of a much larger machinery already in motion. Human suffering feels deeply personal because we experience it inside our own skin. But its roots are rarely isolated. They are biological. They are cultural. They are generational. They are historical. They are often pre-written in systems we did not create. And here is where the story becomes more interesting. What if suffering is not a glitch in the system? What if it is part of the design of consciousness itself? Look at the lives of people around you. Look carefully. Every human being loses something. Everyone. Health fades, youth disappears, loved ones leave or pass away, careers rise and fall, certainty dissolves, no one escapes loss. Not the wealthy, not the powerful, not the disciplined, not the spiritual. Suffering visits every life, though it arrives wearing different costumes, which suggests something remarkable. It is not targeted. It is universal. Yet we resist this idea strongly. Why? Because we want control. We want to believe that if we make the correct choices, if we optimize our habits, if we follow the right philosophy, we can design a life free from pain. But history tells a different story. Families tell a different story. Your own life probably tells a different story. Even when people act wisely, even when they love sincerely, even when they plan carefully, difficulty eventually appears. Not because they failed, but because life moves in cycles. Gain and loss, attachment and separation, health and illness, creation and destruction. The script includes contrast. Think about a man who dedicates 20 years of his life to building a company. He wakes early, sacrifices weekends, postpones vacations, misses birthdays. The company grows slowly. His identity becomes tied to its success. Then suddenly, an economic downturn arrives. Markets shift. Investors pull out. The company collapses. He feels devastated. He believes he failed. But step back and widen the lens. Was the economic crash his personal failure, or was it part of vast economic cycles beyond the control of any single individual? His suffering feels intimate and personal, but the forces shaping it are enormous. And yet there is another layer to this idea. If suffering is pre-written into the story of life, it does not mean we are powerless. It means something subtler. The actor does not control the entire storyline, but the actor still chooses how to perform the scene. Notice the shift. If suffering is random, life feels unfair. If suffering is punishment, life feels cruel. But if suffering is part of a larger script, life begins to feel structured. The pain is still real, but it is no longer a personal attack. Ask yourself something honestly. When you experience heartbreak, do you believe you uniquely failed at love? Or could heartbreak simply be one of the universal chapters of the human story? When anxiety appears in your body, do you assume something is wrong with you? Or could anxiety be the nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do, protecting a fragile creature living in an unpredictable world? When envy appears, do you see it as moral weakness? Or could it be the natural result of social comparison embedded deep inside our evolutionary history? We judge ourselves harshly because we believe we should be above these emotions, but perhaps they are written directly into the script of being human. And once that possibility enters your mind, something subtle begins to change. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" you begin asking a different question. What part of the human story is unfolding here? That question sounds simple, but it quietly changes the way you interpret your own life. Because once you stop assuming that suffering is a personal malfunction, you begin to see it as something much larger than yourself. Look at human history for a moment. Every generation believes it is facing unique problems, and in some ways, that is true. But if you zoom out far enough, the patterns repeat with remarkable consistency. One generation faces war, another faces economic collapse, another faces technological upheaval, another faces social fragmentation. The form of suffering changes, but the presence of suffering remains constant. Your grandparents may have endured scarcity, migration, political instability, or social upheaval. Your parents may have struggled with economic pressure, emotional silence, or expectations they never fully understood. And now your generation carries its own weight: speed, comparison, information overload, constant visibility. Different costumes, same human condition, and yet every generation quietly asks the same question. Why is this happening to us? The deeper truth is that difficulty is not an interruption in the human story, it is one of its main characters. Now here is where the psychological layer becomes even more interesting. Most people only begin questioning their lives when something breaks. When everything is comfortable, predictable, and successful, reflection rarely appears. Comfort keeps the mind busy, but shallow. The deeper questions, who am I? What matters? What am I chasing? Tend to remain buried beneath routine. But when suffering enters the scene, the mind suddenly wakes up. Consider someone who loses a career they believed defined their identity. For years, they thought their job title represented their worth. Promotions meant progress. Recognition meant validation. Their life seemed structured and meaningful. Then one unexpected event dismantles it. The company restructures. The position disappears. The identity collapses. At first, the experience feels purely destructive. It feels like life has stolen something important. The person may spend months or even years feeling lost. But something else quietly begins happening during that period. Questions appear that never existed before. If I am not this role, then who am I? If success is not what I thought it was, then what actually matters? What am I chasing? Those questions rarely appear in comfort. They appear in disruption. This does not mean suffering is pleasant. It is often deeply painful. But pain has a strange property. It breaks the illusions we build around ourselves. Illusions about control. Illusions about permanence. Illusions about identity. Most of us spend years constructing mental stories about who we are. We believe we are our career, our relationships, our achievements, our reputation. These identities feel stable until life inevitably changes the conditions around them. And when those identities collapse, the experience feels terrifying. But from another perspective, something else is happening. The script is pushing the character into a new chapter. Think about literature for a moment. The most meaningful stories never begin with stability. They begin with disruption. The hero loses something. The hero faces uncertainty. The hero must leave the familiar world. Without that disruption, the story never unfolds. Human life follows a similar pattern. Comfort maintains the existing structure. Difficulty forces transformation. You can see this pattern in something as ordinary as adolescence. A child moves through early years feeling safe within the family structure. Identity is simple. Parents provide guidance, protection, and structure. The child does not question much about the world. Then adolescence arrives. Suddenly the body changes. Emotions intensify. Independence begins pushing against authority. Conflicts appear between parents and teenagers that did not exist before. From the inside, the experience feels chaotic. Parents often interpret the behavior as rebellion. Teenagers often interpret the tension as misunderstanding, but step back and observe the biological process unfolding. Adolescence is not a malfunction. It is a transition. The tension exists because identity is evolving. The old structure must loosen so a new structure can emerge. Suffering often signals transition. The same pattern appears again and again in adult life. A relationship ends. A new identity slowly forms. A career collapses. A different direction appears. An illness forces someone to reevaluate how they have been living. At first, these experiences feel like interruptions. Later, they often reveal themselves as turning points. This is why many people describe their most painful experiences as strangely transformative when they look back years later. Not because the pain was enjoyable, but because it forced a deeper awareness. Here is the second crescendo in this story. What if suffering exists partly because consciousness grows through contrast? Imagine a life where nothing difficult ever happened. No heartbreak, no uncertainty, no loss, no failure, no aging, no death. At first, that might sound ideal, but think carefully about what such a life would feel like. If health never disappeared, would you truly appreciate being healthy? If relationships never ended, would you recognize their value while they exist? If success never required effort, would achievement feel meaningful? Without contrast, experience becomes flat. The mind adapts quickly to comfort. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. What once felt exciting soon becomes normal. What once felt extraordinary soon becomes expected. Contrast is what gives experiences depth. Light only becomes visible against darkness. Joy becomes visible against difficulty. Connection becomes visible after loneliness. This does not mean suffering is morally good. It simply means it serves a role in shaping human awareness. Many ancient philosophies recognized this pattern long before modern psychology described it scientifically. In Buddhist thought, suffering is considered a fundamental part of existence. Not because life is meaningless, but because attachment to changing things inevitably produces tension. Everything shifts. Everything evolves. Clinging to permanence creates friction. Stoic philosophy in ancient Greece and Rome also acknowledged this reality. Stoic thinkers did not believe suffering could be eliminated. Instead, they believed wisdom came from understanding what could be controlled and what could not. You can choose your actions. You can choose your character. You can choose your response. But you cannot eliminate uncertainty from life. Once this realization settles into the mind, something subtle begins to relax. The struggle against reality softens. Instead of constantly asking, "How do I avoid pain?" the question shifts toward something else. How do I move through difficulty with awareness? Because difficulty will appear. It always does. The real question is how we interpret it. If you believe suffering means you are failing, every hardship becomes an identity crisis. If you believe suffering means life is unfair, every hardship becomes resentment. But if you begin to see suffering as part of the script of being human, something remarkable happens. The experience still hurts, but it stops feeling personal. And that small shift changes everything. Because much of the suffering people experience today is amplified by one powerful illusion: the illusion of total control. Modern culture quietly tells us that life should be fully manageable. We are told that if we optimize our habits, choose the right career, follow the right strategies, maintain the right mindset, and surround ourselves with the right people, then we should be able to design a life where things mostly go according to plan. Success books promise systems, productivity culture promises efficiency, self-help promises transformation through discipline. Social media displays carefully edited lives that appear perfectly curated. All of these messages carry an unspoken assumption that life should be controllable. And when reality inevitably violates that assumption, people feel something close to personal failure. But look at the deeper structure of existence. Weather cannot be controlled. Markets cannot be controlled. Other people's emotions cannot be controlled. Illness cannot always be prevented. Time cannot be slowed. Aging cannot be reversed. Loss cannot be eliminated. Life contains forces far larger than any individual's ability to manage them. Yet we live in an era that constantly encourages us to believe otherwise. This creates a quiet psychological trap. When people believe they should be able to control life, every unexpected difficulty feels like proof that something has gone wrong with them personally. They assume they made a mistake. They assume they lacked discipline. They assume they failed to think positively enough. But much of what happens in human life emerges from systems that no individual designed and no individual can fully control. Economic cycles rise and fall regardless of personal effort. Cultural trends shift unpredictably. Political changes reshape entire societies. Technologies transform industries almost overnight. Individual lives unfold inside these massive movements, and suffering often emerges where those movements collide with personal expectations. Consider a young professional who spends years preparing for a stable career path. They study diligently, follow advice, develop skills, and imagine a predictable trajectory forward. Then technology changes the entire industry. Artificial intelligence automates tasks that once required years of training. Markets reorganize. Job structures shift. Suddenly, the path that seemed secure begins to dissolve. From the inside, the experience feels deeply personal. The individual may believe they chose the wrong path or failed to anticipate the future. But zoom out far enough and you see something different. Entire generations experience similar disruptions simultaneously. It is not a personal mistake. It is a structural shift, and suffering appears where expectation meets reality. The same pattern appears in relationships. People often enter relationships believing they have finally found emotional certainty. They imagine stability, permanence, and shared direction. They build dreams around those expectations. But human beings themselves are constantly evolving. Values change, needs change, identity changes. Sometimes two people grow in directions neither of them expected. When that happens, the experience feels intensely personal. People ask themselves what they did wrong. They replay conversations, decisions, and moments searching for the mistake that caused the outcome. But relationships exist inside complex emotional ecosystems shaped by personality, history, stress, biology, timing, and circumstance. Not every ending is the result of a single decision. Sometimes it is simply the unfolding of two lives moving through time. And when we expect relationships to be immune to change, suffering intensifies. Now add another modern force to the story: comparison. For most of human history, people compared themselves to relatively small groups: a village, a neighborhood, a local community. Expectations developed within those boundaries. Today, comparison happens globally. A person wakes up and immediately sees thousands of other lives through a small glowing screen. Athletes, entrepreneurs, travelers, artists, influencers, couples celebrating anniversaries, families documenting perfect moments. It becomes almost impossible not to compare. Someone younger seems more successful. Someone else seems happier. Another person appears more confident, more attractive, more fulfilled. The mind quietly begins building a narrative. I am behind. I should be further along. I must have done something wrong. But what we are comparing ourselves to is rarely reality. It is performance. People naturally display the most polished versions of their lives. Struggles remain hidden. Doubts remain hidden. Confusion remains hidden. The result is a distorted mirror, and distorted mirrors generate unnecessary suffering. But notice something important here. Comparison has existed throughout human history. Envy has existed throughout human history. Fear of exclusion has existed throughout human history. The difference today is scale. The script is the same. The stage has simply grown larger. Which brings us to another layer of suffering that often appears in modern life: the collapse of identity. Most people construct their sense of self around certain stable pillars: career, family roles, social status, reputation, or belief systems become the foundation of identity. These structures feel permanent until life rearranges them. A job disappears. A relationship ends. Children grow up and leave home. A belief system no longer makes sense. When these pillars shift, people often experience something that feels like existential vertigo. The question quietly appears: who am I now? At first, the experience can feel terrifying. Identity provided structure. Without it, the mind feels exposed. But from another perspective, identity collapse can also be an opening. The old script loosens. The character begins questioning the role they were playing. Many of the most meaningful changes in human life begin exactly there, in moments when the previous identity no longer fits. A corporate executive loses their job and eventually discovers a different calling. A relationship ends and a person learns to understand themselves more honestly. An illness forces someone to reconsider how they have been living. At the time, these events feel like disruption. Later, they often reveal themselves as redirection. Suffering is frequently the doorway through which deeper awareness enters. And this brings us back to the central idea that began this reflection. What if suffering is not an accident? What if it is written into the script of consciousness itself? Not because life is cruel, but because growth requires movement. Movement requires change, and change inevitably contains friction. Friction creates discomfort. Discomfort pushes awareness forward. The story of being human has always included this sequence, which means suffering may not be evidence that life is broken. It may be evidence that life is unfolding. But here we arrive at the deepest and most uncomfortable layer of this idea. If suffering is woven into the fabric of existence, if so many of the conditions that shape our lives existed before we were even aware of them, then what does that say about control? What does it say about destiny? Modern culture tends to resist the idea of destiny because it sounds like surrender. It sounds like passivity. It sounds like giving up the belief that we are the authors of our lives. But destiny does not necessarily mean helplessness. It may simply mean that we are participating in a story whose larger structure we cannot fully see. Think of an actor stepping onto a stage. The actor did not write the entire script. The actor did not design the set, the lighting, or the other characters entering the scene. And yet the actor still has something meaningful to contribute. The actor interprets the role. The actor decides how the lines are delivered, how the emotions are expressed, how the character moves through each moment. Life may operate in a similar way. Many of the circumstances surrounding your life were arranged long before you arrived. Your birthplace, your genetic makeup, your early environment, the historical era you inhabit. These were not personal decisions. They are the stage upon which your life unfolds. But how you inhabit that stage still matters. This is where determinism and freedom quietly intersect. Determinism suggests that events unfold through chains of causes and conditions. Every moment emerges from countless previous moments, like waves moving through water. But within that unfolding, awareness still exists. Consciousness still observes, interprets, and responds. In other words, you may not control every chapter of the story, but you participate in how the story is experienced. And this changes the way suffering appears. If suffering is seen as random chaos, it feels meaningless. If suffering is seen as punishment, it feels cruel. But if suffering is part of a larger unfolding, part of the movement through which life shapes consciousness, then it begins to look different. It becomes a passage. Not the whole story, a passage. Think about some of the most transformative moments in human lives. Rarely do they occur during periods of perfect stability. They often emerge from moments of uncertainty, disruption, or loss. People question their beliefs when something breaks. They reconsider their priorities when something disappears. They discover unexpected strength when they are forced to move through difficulty. Pain in these moments becomes a strange kind of teacher. Not because pain is morally good, but because pain interrupts the automatic patterns of the mind. It breaks routines, it exposes assumptions, it forces awareness into places we normally avoid. Without these interruptions, many people would simply continue repeating the same patterns indefinitely, and perhaps this is part of what the script of suffering is designed to do. It pushes the character to grow beyond the previous version of themselves. But here's another quiet realization that appears once we accept this idea. If suffering is woven into the script, then joy must be woven into it as well. The same life that contains loss also contains connection. The same story that includes uncertainty also includes discovery. The same human experience that holds anxiety also holds laughter, curiosity, creativity, and love. The script is not only shadow, it is contrast. Imagine reading a novel where nothing difficult ever happened. Every character succeeds immediately. Every relationship remains perfect. Every ambition unfolds smoothly. The story would feel flat, almost meaningless, because nothing challenges the characters to change. The depth of a story emerges from contrast. And human life appears to follow a similar pattern. Joy becomes meaningful partly because it exists alongside difficulty. Connection becomes precious, partly because it can be lost. Moments of peace become vivid precisely because they appear within a world that also contains uncertainty. This perspective does not erase suffering, but it places suffering within a larger landscape. Instead of viewing pain as an attack from the universe, you begin to see it as part of the movement of life itself. And once you see it that way, something inside begins to soften. The constant question, "Why is this happening to me?" slowly loses its intensity. You begin to understand that life was never designed to be perfectly smooth. It was designed to move. Through cycles, through change, through contrast. This realization does something subtle but powerful. It shifts attention away from blame. When suffering is seen only through the lens of fault, people spend enormous energy searching for someone to accuse. They blame themselves. They blame other people. They blame circumstances. They blame fate. But if suffering is part of the broader unfolding of existence, blame becomes less central. Instead, a different question begins to emerge. How do I meet this moment? Not how do I eliminate every difficulty. Not how do I construct a life immune to pain. But how do I move through what is already part of the human story? And surprisingly, that question often brings more peace than the search for perfect control ever could, because the search for control is endless. There will always be new uncertainties, new changes, new chapters appearing unexpectedly, but the ability to meet those chapters consciously, that can grow. It grows through awareness. It grows through humility. It grows through understanding that you are not standing outside the human story, trying to manage it perfectly. You are inside the story, living it moment by moment. And perhaps that is the quiet invitation hidden within suffering itself. Not to resist every difficult scene, not to pretend the story should have been written differently, but to walk through the unfolding narrative with awareness, to recognize that you are not uniquely targeted by life. You are participating in it. The script may contain loss, uncertainty, and challenge, but it also contains curiosity, growth, connection, and wonder. Shadow and light, both written into the story. So, when the next difficult chapter appears, and eventually it will, perhaps the question changes slightly. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you pause, you breathe, and you say quietly to yourself, this is part of the story. Not to surrender helplessly, but to walk through it consciously, because the script may be written, but the way you experience it, the awareness you bring to it, the meaning you discover inside it, that is still unfolding, moment by moment. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more videos and share with others.